love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach when feeling out of sight. For the ends of being in ideal grace, I love thee to the level of everyday's most quiet need by sun and candlelight. I love thee freely as men strive for right. I love thee purely as they turn from praise. I love thee with a passion put to use in my own griefs and with my child's faith. I love thee with a love I seem to lose. I love thee with a passion put to use in my old griefs and with my childhood's faith. I love thee with a love I seem to lose with my lost saints. I love thee with a breath, small tears of all my life, and if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death.
The introduction then to the GCSE Poetry Anthology, Sonnet 43 by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. As normal, we'll be looking at the 3 assessment criteria. Assessment 1, understanding what the poem is about. Assessment Objective 2, the language, form and structure and how these create different effects for the reader. And lastly, AO3, which is context, our knowledge of the time the poem was written, and indeed our knowledge of Elizabeth Barrett Browning herself. Elizabeth Barrett Browning was born 1806 and died 1861, and spent most of her life suffering from headaches and spinal pain. This left her bedridden for most of her life. This started when she was 15, and she was housebound in her own father's house. From her bed, she became well known as a poet in England and America, something that was quite rare at the time, particularly for a woman. She campaigned for the abolition of slavery and was politically active. She was even a rival for Tennyson for the role of the poet laureate. She was a powerful writer, a position that almost was unheard of at that time, again particularly for a woman. When she was 40, she read Robert Browning's poems and used one of them in her own writing. Robert was an instant fan of hers and began to write to her and was delighted to find that she responded. He asked her to marry him before they even met, and the couple was soon married. Elizabeth's father hated the match and disinherited her as soon as she tied the knot. This is a bit like writing to your favourite celebrity from the films or the movies, and them actually replying to you wanting to meet up. Your mother or father might well think this is ridiculous, this cannot be real, and so warn you against it. But in Elizabeth's case, it was genuine, and her and Robert had a fairly happy marriage.
One of the greatest love stories in all of British literature is that of Robert Browning and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who lived in a house on this site. Elizabeth Barrett was an invalid most of her life. She was the daughter of a pathologically overprotective father. He didn't want any of his children to marry, and he kept Elizabeth as a virtual prisoner in this house. From her upstairs room, Elizabeth wrote and published poetry and carried on a voluminous correspondence with various people in the arts. "50 Wimpole Street is Elizabeth Barrett's famous address. Robert Browning was from the other side of London, south of the River Thames, in an area destroyed in World War II. Robert Browning had a difficult start in his writing career. He wrote poems and plays that received terrible reviews. The reviews were very discouraging to him. Robert Browning began publishing a series of poems and plays called Bells and Pomegranates. Elizabeth Barrett read his work and wrote about it in one of her own poems. Or, from Browning, some pomegranate, which if cut deep down the middle, shows a heart, blood-tinctured of a veined humanity. Browning was overwhelmed by this line, feeling that at last he'd found someone who understood him and his poetry. He immediately began writing to her and even proposed before they'd ever met. Eventually, he did visit her in her room, where she occasionally received visitors. The letters they sent back and forth are some of the most famous love letters ever written. Eventually, Robert persuaded Elizabeth to marry him. Because of her father, she had to sneak out of the house with the help of one of her sisters and her maid, and fainting several times along the way, she traveled the few blocks to Marylebone Church, where they were married.
Let's listen to the poem then, How Do I Love Thee, otherwise known as Sonnet 43.
How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach, when feeling out of sight for the ends of being and ideal grace. I love thee to the level of every day's most quiet need, by sun and candlelight. I love thee freely, as men strive for right. I love thee purely, as they turn from praise. I love thee with a passion put to use in my old griefs and with my childhood's faith. I love thee with a love I seem to lose with my lost saints. I love thee with the breath, smiles, tears of all my life. And if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death.
A beautiful love poem then, about the purity of love and it being everlasting. As normal, we're now going to annotate the poem itself. It's a good idea to get a copy of the poem in front of you and add maybe a shorter version of these annotations to your own copy for your own revision notes. The structural notes are going to appear in red, and the language notes, those are the notes based on language choices that Browning made, are going to appear in white. The title then promotes or prompts us to think this is a traditional sonnet. One of 44 such sonnets written to Browning before the two got married. Normally a sonnet is written from a man to a woman, so this subverts this as the poem is from a woman to a man. This is called a patriarchan sonnet, the traditional form of a sonnet, perhaps to suggest that love itself is ageless. The opening line has an interesting tone. It seems defensive, as if answering a request. Or is it perhaps demanding, as if this person is surprised at the question? How do I love thee? Sometimes the poem is printed with an exclamation mark at the end of the line, perhaps to show excitement at being asked the question in the first place. This is also a rhetorical question, which is then answered to emphasise the excitement of the speaker as they try to describe their feelings. Depth, breadth, and height are all examples of scientific vocabulary used to describe love. In fact, these three, depth, breadth, height, form a spatial metaphor, suggesting that the idea of love is hard to put into human terms. This is juxtaposed with the religious imagery to emphasise the power of love and its link to God. Religious imagery such as soul or grace in the next two lines. The noun soul suggests that love for the writer isn't superficial or fake, it's almost spiritual, which implies the depth of her emotions. But the soul isn't godly, it is simply the core or part of your consciousness. This then juxtaposes the soul with the word grace in the next line. This is her religious side or her spiritual side, and she's suggesting that this is equally affected by her love for Robert. Now to the middle of the poem, as the poem's theme develops. You can see she describes a most quiet need by sun and candlelight in the second line of this stanza. This links to domestic needs. Barrett Browning is suggesting she will fulfil the female role at the time as a housewife. Remember, she is a very famous woman, so she could easily get some servants to do this for her. But because she loves Robert so much, she's willing to do anything it takes to show her love for him. We've got symbols of light here repeated, perhaps suggesting youth and old age, sun and then the candlelight in line number 2. Then we have these 3 lines in which repetition is clearly used. I love thee, I love thee, I love thee. This is to exaggerate the strength of her love and almost plead to make the message clearer. That is, the fact she loves Robert so much that she can hardly find the words to express it. She once again links to God. Often, right and praise are capitalised in the poem, which implies a strong link to religion, as if her belief in Robert is strong or stronger than her faith. Here, when she suggests, I love thee purely, she is suggesting that love is pure and doesn't need admiration. But it could also be a metaphor that the love is holy and above humankind. She then goes on to mention the passion she feels in her love. Love is described in negative terms here repeatedly, as if the love she has is painful or consuming. Passion actually means to be affected, but links to suffering for a greater good, like Christ on the cross. He's in pain, but he's doing it for the greater good of man. She then mentions old griefs, in my old griefs with my childhood's faith. This suggests her love is so intense, it's comparable to pain, which might be the pain she felt in a disease when she was young, when she first suffered from it when she was 15. She's comparing the overwhelming sensation of love with overwhelming pain. And now to the end of the poem, or the poem's conclusion. She mentioned lost saints, which might suggest her love for God is dying and being replaced by her love for Robert. There are many more religious links by the end of this poem, where God becomes a heavenly father to whom Emily is asking permission to love Robert before and after death. Notice there it says, if God choose, as if it's God being the father figure who's going to decide how much or how long she's going to love Robert for. The poem juxtaposes the extreme emotions of life to suggest that her love for Robert is constant through the highs and lows of her existence. At the end of the poem, it clearly mentions the word death and then a full stop. The noun death at the end of the poem suggests the confidence that the writer has that her love will be everlasting. Nothing will ever stop her from loving Robert. If you look at the whole poem, please look for links for childhood, old age and death. This suggests that love for Robert has been there throughout her whole life, and it's only now that it's coming into fruition. Sonnet 43 by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, The Essential Facts. Who is it about? This is Elizabeth Barrett Browning expressing the power of her love to her husband-to-be. What is it about? The poet compares the strength of her love to a religious love and the pain she felt as a child. Why was it written? Barrett Browning was worried about her health. She was a confident woman who wanted to make her emotions and intentions clear to ensure that her husband-to-be stayed with her. Now I'm going to show you 3 key quotes. Please pause the screen after each set of notes has been revealed, and obviously add these to your revision notes for this poem. That is then quote number 1. Quote number 2. And quote number 3. Notice the 3 quotes that I've chosen come from the beginning, the middle and the end of the poem. This is the same for all the quotes for all the other poems of the anthology that I've covered. I always try and choose a spread of quotes that often cover 2 lines, giving you the chance to comment on the enjambment used in between those lines. Now let's take a look at exam technique. You can see on the screen at the moment, this is the exam paper you'll be faced with, or an example of it at least. You can see you've got 2 questions to answer. The first one, labelled here 7.1, asked us to read one poem, in this case Sonnet 43, and then the task itself is here. Sonnet 43 is a poem about love. How does Elizabeth Barrett Browning present love in the poem? Remember to refer to the context of the poem in your answer. You can see it's got the number of marks it's worth, which is 15 marks. You would spend about 25 minutes on this at most, before going on to 7.2, where it asks you to choose one other poem from the anthology in which the poet writes about love. Compare how the poet presents love in your chosen poem and the way that Elizabeth Barrett Browning presents love in Sonnet 43. The number of marks this is worth is 25, so a lot more marks for the second question, but it then gives you a list of bullet points to cover. In your answer, you must cover the content and structure of the poems, how the writers create effects using appropriate terminology where relevant, and the context of the poems, how these may influence the ideas in them. You can see the 3 bullet points here link to the assessment objectives that I started this video with. Now underneath you can see a copy of the poem, Sonnet 43. For 7.1, it gives you the poem to actually talk about. So it's all about there remembering what we've taught you in lessons, remember what you've revised, and then using that in exam answer, in this case linked to the theme of love. 7.2 is asking you to compare the poem that's printed with one that you've had to memorise. So you need to remember the quotes from the poem of your choice and think about how best to connect those with Sonnet 43 in this case. Obviously other themes could come up such as violence or nature or time, and then the poem named here would be different, and then you compare with another poem about time or nature or violence of your choice. Just thought I'd give you an example then of what the exam's actually going to look like. Today we're going to focus particularly on how to get started into a response. This section is going to cover how to write a short introduction, how to create a point, how to link to context, and how to begin to look for quotes to start your analysis off. I tend to think of a poem as being a bit like an iceberg. It's got a really simple meaning that everyone in the exam hall can see. Think that being our sort of grade 2 then. But it's also got a massive body underneath it, a massive area that we can't see under the surface of the poem, we have to look hard for. This is the hidden meaning of the poem, and there will always be one for all the poems in the anthology. There's always going to be a hidden, deeper meaning to them. For example, Sonnet 43 is obviously about love. Everyone in the room, from bottom grade to top grade, will be able to say that. But it's love for what that comes through in this poem. Yes, it's a love for Robert, but we also have a love of God creeping in there. And potentially the comparison between pain and love is also something that makes it a bit more special, a bit more interesting to kind of analyse and explore further. Before you start an exam answer, you need to think about what this simple meaning is. For example then, I would start my response by saying, simplistically, Sonnet 43 is about a strong love that Elizabeth Browning feels towards Robert. That's the answer everyone in the room will say. But then I need to think about that deeper meaning. Now, the paragraph or my introduction here shows us how to write that. I start with simplistically, Sonnet 43 is about a strong love that Elizabeth Browning feels towards Robert. Then I say, however, the poet challenges us to think about the power and pain of love and how it can be stronger than belief in God. Notice that I'm showing the depth of my understanding of the poem and not just relying on a very simple answer to show the exam board. I get that response by thinking about what the poet is trying to say under the surface, the poet's message or the poem's meaning. Think about what your teacher has said about the poem. They're very likely to have explored with you the message or the meaning of the poem studied. From there, we divide the poem into 3, as you can see on the board. That's why, as I go through the notes, I always divide the poem into 3 pieces. Once we've written our introduction, shown in blue, we then begin to think about the beginning, the middle, and the end of the poem. Now, the examiner knows that we've studied the poem, so looking in your answer for particular ideas and evidence the poem has been revised and is well known by you. Today we're just going to focus on the opening of the poem then, the start of the poem. And I begin to think about just what this section shows. I think about how it begins, what ideas it contains, and what the main point is of this section. So if I look at this as a paragraph of an answer, what information does just this paragraph tell me? These are some sentence options I could start with. At the start of the poem, right from the introduction, or from the outset. I tend to like to use from the outset because it suggests that that's going to change through the rest of the poem. It's also quicker to write. This will focus on assessment objective 1 then, showing clear understanding of what the poem is about. From the outset, Browning begins to explain what love is by using references to religion to show how far she'll go for love. You can see I've mentioned the name of the poet in blue, and I've explained my answer in green. Now I begin to build on my response by thinking about relevant context. That's things I know about the poet or the setting of the poem that is relevant to the point I've just made. I'll need to think about what I know about the poet, what I know about when it's written, and which parts of the information above are relevant to the start of the poem. Well, as you know, we've got all this information about her shown earlier in this clip, but the bit that's relevant to the beginning of the poem in particular is where Elizabeth Barrett Browning asked her to marry him before they even met, and the couple was soon married. Elizabeth's father hated the match and disinherited her as soon as she tied the knot. So the part in yellow is the part I'm going to use in my next sentence. In blue then, Elizabeth came from a religious background and fell in love with Robert Browning at 40, but her religious father hated the match. This hits assessment objective 3, relevant knowledge of context. I now need to think about the quotes I'd want to choose next. Now I've got lots of notes on all the different words used, so I need to think carefully which ones might be the ones that would get me the highest grade. I need to look at the whole start of the poem and think about quotes that can be linked together. And I also need to decide which quote is probably going to be my best answer, which one can I explain the most. I'll need to think about what I know about this part of the poem, what quote you feel most confident with saying a lot about, what technical language you can use to describe the words or ideas used here. Many students tend to ask me what technical language is. What is technical language, sir? Well, this is the term used to describe particular subject-specific words to use in your answer. For example, noun, verb, rhetorical question, simile, metaphor, personification, or even as simple as the word word, all count as technical language. Now this is an example of one of the quotes I gave earlier. This is one that it is in the opening of the poem, and so would be the notes I'd use to write up into my answer. I also have my notes around the whole poem, or my labels here. So all these notes are all relevant to the beginning of the poem and all be ones that I'd want to try and tell the examiner in the actual exam. Of course, there's too many there to actually cover in the time limit I've got, so I need to think carefully which one is the one I understand the most, or which one is most relevant to the question I'm being asked. Okay, so far then, I've covered Assessment Objective 1 and Assessment Objective 3. I now need Assessment Objective 2, that is the effect of word or language choices. I begin collecting the quotes. Now in blue, you can see I've begun to connect the ones that link to religion. She, Elizabeth, uses words like soul, feeling out of sight, and ideal grace to suggest that love is equal or more powerful than even love for God, as she wants Browning to know how much she cares. I've linked a set of 3 quotes then that all have something in common and explain what they suggest, and gone on to explain that linked to the question set, in this case the theme of love. That would then hit Assessment Objective 2. My full answer then might read like this. This would be my full paragraph about the beginning of the poem. Notice that I've gone on to explain more quotes using the notes I had and begun to analyse, where I've focused on the word soul and the word height in particular. I have notes on these, so I want to use those in the actual test. You will notice right at the end of this answer, I do go back to Assessment Objective 1 and begin thinking, well, what is the poem about? As you can see on the left then, I've hit Assessment Objective 1 twice, Assessment Objective 3 once, and I've really gone to town on Assessment Objective 2, my language choices and effective language. In reality, that's where most of my marks are going to come from. The green one, the green skill, AO2, effective language, is where most of the mark will come from. My opening paragraph then reads, from the outset, Browning begins to explain what love is by using references to religion to show how far she'll go for love. Elizabeth came from a religious background and fell in love with Robert Browning at 40, but her religious father hated the match. She uses words like soul, feeling out of sight, and ideal grace to suggest that love is equal or more powerful even than love for God, as she wants Browning to know how much she cares. The quote, I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach, is important as it uses a spatial metaphor to try and describe love, as these are terms that Robert would understand. The word soul suggests the love she feels is deep and true, and contrasts with the more clinical language she uses in the second line. The tone of this line is confident, as Elizabeth attempts to make clear her love and describe it in human terms using simple, straightforward language. The enjambment after height, which is where the line splits up and the next line continues, implies that we should imagine the size of the emotion she's feeling. We are challenged to think about the power of love and the commitment Browning feels towards Robert, as she uses many ways to describe the love she feels. From this point, I go on to the middle of the poem and then the end of the poem, thereby completing my answer. You might be thinking, well, there's a lot of words there, there's a lot of detail there, do I have to write that in every paragraph? No, you do not need to do that each paragraph, but you would need to show the key skills, that is the assessment objectives on the left, as often as you possibly can. By practicing writing answers, sitting down and thinking how your notes would work on the page, you'll be practicing getting faster and faster in the quite pressurised situation you'd be in the test. Lastly then, we need to think about what poem we could compare Sonnet 43 to. We have Valentine, as both are talking about intimate personal love. We have She Walks in Beauty, as both reflect on emotions that transcend human beings. Or we have a contrast to Cosy Apologia, whose love is seen through everyday objects rather than something more spiritual or religious. Thank you very much then for listening to this presentation on Sonnet 43 by Elizabeth Barrett Browning.